Greetings. My name is Patricia Maria Weinman, and I'm the Associate Coordinator of Radius at MIT. Welcome to the program, and thank you for being here. This panel discussion is being co-sponsored by the MIT Faculty Newsletter. We will be utilizing the Q&A function. The panelists have requested that you save your questions until their initial presentations have been given. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan King, who will be moderator and a participant in this event. Jonathan is a longtime member of the Radius Steering Committee and a good friend. He'll introduce our other esteemed guests, Professor Robert Redwine and Professor Elaine Scari. Jonathan is Professor of Molecular Biology Emeritus at MIT, and he's the co-chair of the board of the Massachusetts Peace Action and chairs the program committee of our annual Reducing the Threat of Nuclear War conferences. He's the author of numerous articles on the excessive costs of nuclear weapons and the danger of such weapons. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Elaine and Robert.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Trish, and thank you for all attending. In the period following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, physicists at MIT were among the leading group in the country opposing the expansion of nuclear weapons. In the past 2 years, we have, and let me get full screen here. In the past 2 years, we have lost the last members of the core group, Kostas Sipis and Aaron Bernstein. Aaron was a core member of the editorial board of the faculty newsletter, and this seminar in his memory is co-sponsored by the faculty newsletter. Now, the world remains awash in nuclear weapons, with the arsenals of US, Russia, China, and other nations far larger than could be rationally explained by the claimed need for nuclear deterrence. The new SALT treaty, strategic arms limitation, which is still in force, one of the few treaties still in force, commits the signatories to reducing the number of deployed nuclear weapons to 1,550. These are almost all on hair trigger alert. Thousands of other nuclear weapons remain in kind of active storage. It wasn't covered by the treaty. Now, 1,550 is already extraordinary overkill. To give a sense of this, consider a single Ohio-class submarine, USS 14, armed with 24 Trident D5 missiles with 8 independently targeted nuclear warheads each. By the way, those W68, W76 warheads, 475 kilotons, way more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One submarine launching its weapons is enough destructive power to eliminate the major cities of any country on Earth, whether Russia, India, or China. And the Navy maintains 14 of these submarines, and the nuclear weapons lobby is pushing for buying 8 more as replacements. Now, Bob will describe when he talks the further the exacerbation of nuclear arms race with new and upgraded weapons. But I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the cost of these programs to US society, even if the weapons are never used. Now, here's the Congressional Discretionary budget before the pandemic, 2017. More than half of the Congressional Discretionary budget went to the Pentagon. Of course, not all nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons are a good chunk of it and an increasing part of it. An aspect of this slide, which you can't normally find, is that it breaks out the National Institutes of Health, responsible for all research and prevention on all the afflictions, Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, stroke, et cetera, and pandemic prevention. And the NSF, which is 0.6% then. Basically, what you see is why the US was unprepared for the pandemic, because we had bled dry the programs like the NIH and NSF, NOAA, etc. Now, some people are very skeptical and say, well, the Pentagon budget is separate from the civilian budget. There's no crossover. In fact, that is absolutely not true. One of the mechanisms for spending half your income tax dollars on the Pentagon is to cut the civilian programs. So here we go. President Trump's 2018 budget proposes cuts in discretionary spending for most government agencies to pay for increases in military spending. And when the director, Mick Mulvaney, was asked by the Republican governors why were they cutting these popular programs, he said simply that the White House priority was more military spending, and that other reductions were necessary to advance the goal. There's one discretionary budget. You buy a new nuclear submarine for $10 billion. That's $10 billion less for healthcare, et cetera. Now, you've all seen the newspapers, the radio, TV in the last weeks, constant discussion about the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. Over 10 years, it's only $350 billion a year, 3.5 trillion over 10 years. And constant articles about, oh, how are we going to pay for it? How the nation is going to pay for it? We'd be bankrupt. Well, you know, in the same period, but absent any mention in the newspapers or on TV or by most political leaders, the Congress voted $768 billion for next year's National Defense Appropriation Act. $768 billion over 10 years is 7.7 trillion. And you know that's a minimum because it goes up each year. More than double the 3.5 trillion civilian reconciliation bill. So there's no money for healthcare, no money for education, no money for paid leave, no money for maternal health, but there's plenty of money for new weapons. It's, you know, it's outrageous, and the silence is outrageous. So there are a number of campaigns underway in the nation. No First Use, which we are most associated with, Back from the Brink, again, an effort to launch a nuclear disarmament motion in the US, and then pressure to have the United States sign on to the UN Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. At the end of Elaine will talk explicitly about a No First Use campaign and how you can participate. So at that, let me introduce Robert Redwine. He is a long-term member of the physics department, nuclear physicist in MIT, and also heavily involved in science education, member of the editorial board of the faculty newsletter. And Bob is going to share with us some of the scary recent developments around upgrading nuclear weapons. Bob, take it away.
Okay, let me get in full screen mode. Okay, hello to everyone. Thank you for being here. I assume that you can hear me and see my screen.
We don't see your screen. Well, it's not the screen you want to show. You're showing the, it's not your slides.
You can't see the slides?
No, it's the Zoom, the general Zoom page. Just close that.
Oh, sorry. I'm gonna do that. Okay. Now I'll go back and share. Where did it go? Sorry about this.
There we go. You got it.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay. So let me go to full screen. All right.
Good.
So let me first talk a little bit about the early history of nuclear weapons. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nuclear fission weapons. That is, they involved the splitting of heavy nuclei, in particular uranium, plutonium, And the energy that they released corresponded to about 13 kilotons of dynamite in the case of Hiroshima and 21 kilotons of dynamite in the case of Nagasaki. That's a huge amount of energy, obviously, but as you'll see, it doesn't compare to very strongly to current weapons, but we know it did a huge amount of damage in the short term and longer term to these two cities. The estimates are each explosion caused about 70,000 immediate deaths and about 80,000 additional deaths within a few months. And we now know that in addition to relatively short-term deaths, nuclear weapons cause many more long-term illnesses and deaths, mostly from cancer due to radiation exposure, as well as much damage to the environment. And it's important to note that the damage to the environment is not really localized because of fallout across the globe. The damage to the environment will be very widespread. Okay, in the years following the Second World War, the US and other countries developed so-called hydrogen bombs, which use the fusion of light nuclei, light isotopes of hydrogen to produce much more powerful explosion. A typical hydrogen bomb has an energy release of something on the order of 1 megaton of dynamite, which is about 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. So we are talking about just hugely powerful weapons, a single weapon. And the current nuclear weapons that are deployed by the major powers are almost entirely hydrogen bombs. As Jonathan indicated, the USA and Russia, major countries that have nuclear weapons and deploy them, currently have about 7,000 nuclear warheads. Of those, slightly less than 2,000 in each case are actively deployed, but the remainder still exist in the stockpile. These numbers are actually significantly less than was the case during the Cold War, when the USA and Soviet Union had between 30 and 40,000 nuclear warheads. However, it is important, I mean, it's good that the amount deployed are significantly less than they used to be, but they're still just hugely large numbers when it comes to the power of the weapons and the danger to humanity and to the planet. In addition, 7 other nations besides the USA and Russia do have nuclear weapons, and they have the option, of course, to decide to use them. In addition, we worry about the danger of rogue states or rogue groups getting access to nuclear weapons. That's a genuine threat as well. What would it take to change life as we know it on Earth? Probably only on the order of 10 nuclear weapons exploding anywhere on the Earth. It would end life as we know it. And that's really sobering when you realize that the USA and Russia have around 2,000 actively deployed. Because of this, many of us believe that if humanity is to survive for the long term, we must eliminate nuclear weapons. We know it's not going to be easy, but we must have that as a goal. In the meantime, before we're able to totally eliminate nuclear weapons, it's obviously very important to reduce the likelihood that a nuclear war could be started accidentally or by bad judgment. So we definitely should work toward encouraging the no first use that Jonathan referred to, and we'll hear more about later. And of course, limiting the ability of a single person to launch nuclear weapons. We do know that there have been some near misses over the years involving nuclear weapons, where it turns out individuals on both sides, Russia and the United States, were reluctant to go ahead and launch until they were absolutely sure that they were being attacked, and they weren't being attacked. So thank goodness that those individuals were reluctant. But we really need to limit the ability of a single person to launch nuclear weapons. And this, of course, this point is the focus of today's discussion. There actually was at least a mildly encouraging development recently, which I was disappointed got rather little play in the press. But in their summit that occurred a few months ago, Biden and Putin actually reiterated a statement that Reagan and Gorbachev had issued in the 1980s to the effect that a nuclear war cannot be won, therefore one should never restart. This, of course, can, if one really believes that, and it's true, then one should move to totally eliminate nuclear weapons. However, as Jonathan referred to, the US has recently launched plans to spend very large amounts of money on upgrading, in particular, our submarine and land-based missile system. This makes really no sense and will just increase the long-term existential threat that nuclear weapons pose currently. In particular, land-based missile systems serve as kind of a target for other countries if they want to, for example, attack the United States and reduce our ability to launch nuclear weapons. Submarines cannot really be located and monitored by other countries. But of course, other countries know exactly where our land-based missiles are located. So it really makes no sense to keep land-based missiles in the current environment. And our submarine-based missile system doesn't really need upgrading. It's a huge threat to other countries. What we need to do is to get rid of it. So we hear a lot these days about the existential threat posed by climate change, and that's absolutely correct. It's true. We should indeed do everything we can to reduce this threat. However, nuclear weapons also pose an absolutely existential threat to humanity. And this threat will exist until we do manage to eliminate all nuclear weapons. And the focus of this meeting is a key step to reaching this goal. I just want to comment, actually at MIT, we have a program called the Nuclear Weapons Education Project, which I currently lead. And the goal of this program is really to provide material to young people and to their teachers in particular, both in high school and in college, to educate the younger generations about the existential threat that is posed by nuclear weapons. For those people like me who grew up during the Cold War, we were very aware of that. I was in high school during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in fact, living in Northern Virginia, very near Washington. And many families actually just moved hundreds of miles away during the crisis because Washington was considered such a threat. And so we have been very aware of existential threat, but the younger generations in general are not. They hear much more about climate change than they do about the threat of nuclear weapons. And we really need to do more to educate them about that. So thank you all very much. I look forward to questions later.
All right. Thank you, Bob. We'll come back to questions after we hear from Elaine. Our wrap-up speaker, Professor Elaine Scarry, the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics at Harvard University and author of the enormously influential Thermonuclear Monarchy. Elaine has really been the national leader in pressing Congress and many of us to address the issue of first use and presidential fingers on the trigger. She chaired the 2 national conferences on no first use and is really the leader on the current campaign. So Elaine, please take over.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As Jonathan and Robert Wedwine have said, grasping the scale of the nuclear arsenal is hard to do. The New York Times a couple of years ago tried to calculate how many weapons would be needed to decimate the population of 7 countries, in order to understand the scale of the United States nuclear arsenal. So they said, what if our weapons were used against Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China? Here's the amount of the arsenal that would be left over after slaying all those other populations. These would be left over, 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 and these would be left over. Over 70% of our arsenal would be left, despite the fact that our arsenal is now smaller than it was in the 1980s, something that's often celebrated without realizing how nearly preposterous, and I think one could even say obscene, our current arsenal is. Here's a picture of the overall arsenal. Though there's much to learn from this graphic, I'll just stress a small number of things. First, each icon on this graphic represents 5 warheads, not 1 warhead, but 5 warheads. The blue are submarine-launched weapons. The red are ground-based weapons like the ICBMs. The green are air-delivered systems, weapons, and the gray are retired warheads. That is, warheads that are nominally retired but have not been dismantled and therefore are available for use. The second thing to know about this graph is one that Professors King and Redwine have already talked about, namely that 93% of the world arsenal is owned either by the United States or Russia. The United States owns everything from 3 o'clock down to 7 o'clock. Russia owns everything from 8 o'clock over to 2 o'clock. And then that small wedge up at 2 o'clock are the other 7 nuclear powers. Many of the nuclear threats or so-called nuclear threats that we talk about, such as Iran or Iraq, are of course not on here since they have no nuclear weapons. North Korea is on here, although it has, by best estimates, fewer than 40. One last thing to notice about this graphic is the Doomsday Clock from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists at the center, which is now set for 100 seconds to midnight. Not only peace activists around the country, but people who have served in government close to the nuclear arsenal say that the dangers now are higher than in the 20th century. Former Secretary of State Kissinger, for example, was quoted in The Guardian in July as saying, due to advances in artificial intelligence and other technologies, we're now in greater peril than we were in the 20th century. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, has also said that we're in more danger now than we were during the Cold War, and he himself is devoting his life to trying to wake up the American citizenry and enlist their help on this. One other person who speaks out in this way is the former head of the nuclear triad, General Lee Butler, who says that our worth as a human species is going to be measured by our ability to step forward and insist that these be dismantled. Now, despite the complexity of the tremendous nuclear arsenal, there's a way in which it can be helpfully understood if one just thinks of the normal model of a weapon, a knife or a gun that has 2 ends, one end out of which the injuring arrives, the other end, the end from which it's fired. The reason this is helpful in nuclear architecture is that nuclear architecture is highly unusual, exceptional in both ends. What makes the injuring end of a nuclear weapon unusual is the catastrophically high number of people who will be slain in a single afternoon. And what makes the firing end unusual is the fact that all that weaponry can be unleashed by a single individual, so that the very form of weapon that magnifies greatly the injury minimizes the agency, responsibility, and breaking power at the firing end. Normally, war has many breaks on it, as you have to go through and get the authorization and the agreement to fight by many different people. With nuclear weapons, all that's gone, since the president can launch the weapon. Indeed, that is the current arrangement in our country, to launch the weapon without any second consultation at all, and to do so, as former missile silo man Bruce Blair says, in a launch order that is actually shorter than a tweet. In the past presidency of Donald Trump, many people in the United States and throughout the world greatly worried that he would launch a nuclear weapon. And this was certainly something that everyone here and in other countries needed to be worried about because of his somewhat unpredictable behavior on many fronts. The reason we have a constitution was precisely to prevent having one man have so much power. In the 19th century, one of our leading jurists, Justice Davis, said that no nation has the right to expect that it will always have wise and humane leaders. And in fact, if we go back to the Constitution itself, Madison said that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And that's why you have to be a country of laws and not a country of men. Now, what the fear about Trump was incorrect about was in believing that this was somehow very exceptional, because it wasn't exceptional at all. We know from the history of the 20th century that other presidents contemplated using the nuclear weapon and using it first. That is, when there was no one actually having performed an aggressive act against us. Eisenhower considered using an atomic weapon in the 1954 Taiwan Straits crisis, and again considered using it in 1959 in Berlin. That's a matter of elaborately documented record. We know from Robert McNamara, who worked with John F. Kennedy, that Kennedy, according to McNamara, 3 times, not once in Cuba, but 3 times came within a hair's breadth. That's McNamara's word, came within a hair's breadth of all-out nuclear war. Nixon has said that he 4 times contemplated using an atomic weapon. And if one believes that maybe by contemplated, you mean the wisp of an idea goes through a mind, no, that is not what is meant. Nixon actually had 18 B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons that went on a flight over Russia. It wasn't at a moment when he was going to drop the weapons, but it could have easily been misconstrued as such. Finally, Lyndon Johnson contemplated using a nuclear weapon against China to prevent China from getting a weapon. Why does the record stop here? It stops here because presidential actions, unlike congressional actions, are closed, they're hidden, they're secret. So only after 2 or 3 decades, when presidential papers are released, do we learn what's happening. That means that any contemplated use of atomic weapons during the 21st century, we probably will be hearing about 15 years or 20 years from now. And those citizens living in the future will shrug and say, well, at least it's not now. While of course, it's always now. There's a second reason why it's useful to think of the nuclear arsenal in terms of both the end that produces the injury and the firing end. And that's because international law that both Jonathan and Bob have mentioned, the international law addresses the illegality and immorality of that scale of suffering. That's true of the current international ban on nuclear weapons, and it's true of earlier protocols such as the Geneva Protocols, the Hague Protocol, the Convention Against Genocide, the conventions against hurting the ozone layer, and so forth. And it's useful to know that in 1995, when 78 countries went to the International Court of Justice begging, urging that nuclear weapons be declared illegal, that our country, in a joint statement by the Department of Defense and the Department of State, said that having nuclear weapons, threatening to use nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons, and using nuclear weapons first does not violate Hague or Geneva or the protocols on the ozone layer. It doesn't even violate the Convention on Genocide, because they argued though millions of people would die, our intention would not be to eliminate a race, a particular race. By the way, a number of our contemplated uses and our one actual use have been against non-white populations. The most recent work on nuclear winter shows that if even not 1% of the total arsenal, but 0.03% of the total arsenal is used, 20 million people will die on the first afternoon and 1 million on the first month. The international treaty is meant to stop that. It can't remedy it after it happens. The International Red Cross has said if even a single city is hit, it doesn't have the resources to come in and help people. It can only help if we act beforehand. Now, the firing end of the weapon is addressed by national law, by constitutional law, that makes it utterly unconstitutional for a single person to be carrying out an injury on a foreign population. The Constitution places 2 brakes on our going to war. The first, and both of them are wildly misunderstood in the nuclear age. The first is the requirement for a Congressional declaration of war. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, that says before this country can ever begin to injure a foreign population, it must have been subjected to the deliberation of the full Congress. That would be today 535 people. Once nuclear weapons were invented, we ceased having any congressional declaration of war, not even for conventional wars, as in Korea or Vietnam. We had authorizations of force, which are much easier to pass. So this whole thing was just jettisoned and treated as junk, in the same way that normative philosophy started being treated as junk. There's not only was that break put aside, but a second break in the Constitution that we won't really have time to go into today, but is very important. The right to bear arms has also been mystified and made illegible to its own population. The original idea of the right to bear arms was to say that however much injuring power the country had, whether zero or a great deal, it would be equally distributed across all of us, and we would have the obligation to speak and authorize our portion of it. And this acted as a way of, again, allowing for the possibility of dissent. For example, it's well known that in the Civil War, the North won in part because in the South, 250 people deserted on the Southern side by the end of the war. So presidential first use, there are 2 bills currently in Congress that prohibit presidential first use and presidential sole authority. The first is the Markey-Liu bill that restricts first use in the absence of a congressional declaration of war. That's Senate Bill 1148 and House Bill 669. The second bill is the Warren-Smith bill that stipulates that this country will henceforth have a no first use policy, as some other countries already have. The first one has enough co-sponsors in the Senate and the House for it now to be brought forward to the floor of Congress. The second one, the Warren-Smith bill, also has enough sponsors that it can be brought to the floor of Congress. And therefore, we should realize that we're at a moment when eliminating presidential sole authority and presidential first use can be accomplished. It can be accomplished because the legislation is already in Congress to prohibit sole authority on constitutional grounds. Second of all, the current president, President Biden, before being elected, repeatedly spoke out against first use. And he has the power to announce a no first use policy in the upcoming nuclear posture review. But neither of these 2 avenues of repair, the legislative or the presidential, will ever come into being unless the population begins to step up to the plate, take responsibility, and insist that this legislation be passed and that we take ourselves out of the deeply immoral and criminal situation that we're in with these terrible, terrible weapons. I should just mention briefly that other nuclear states also have constitutional provisions that their populations can bring to bear on their arsenals, along with the international treaty. That is, France, India, and Russia all have constitutional provisions that say their parliament, or the equivalent of our Congress, is responsible for overseeing the declaration of war. The way some countries phrase this is to say that the monarch or the head leader or the president or the executive can act up to the border to defend the country, but taking one step over the border, that is beginning to inflict injury on a foreign population requires the authorization of Parliament. So just as presidential first use and presidential sole authority really are at a moment where we can eliminate them, so too the entire nuclear architecture can be eliminated. And we have to lift ourselves out of this completely false belief that once nuclear weapons are made, they can't be unmade. That is a kind of crazy idea. By introducing no first use and eliminating sole authority, I believe it would introduce a kind of spiral fracture into the whole nuclear architecture. But even without that, people have studied this and they see that unlike global warming, which is going to be very hard to roll back, we may all, as Bob Redwine was saying, ardently want it to be rolled back, but it's hard to roll it back. The nuclear situation is, as diplomat Thomas Countryman has said, global warming at supersonic speed, and that can be rolled back much more easily. It's just a matter of dismantling the weapons. John Ainsley, a Scottish author, made a study of eliminating the British arsenal of the 4 Trident submarines that Britain has, and found that some parts of it could be dismantled in hours. That was dismantling the nuclear triggers. Other parts take much longer to dismantle, but the whole thing could be done in between 2 and 4 years. Obviously, it would take much longer to dismantle the US and Russian arsenals because they're vastly bigger, but it's a doable task, step by step. Hope that we can eliminate these arsenals is also provided by the fact that the whole southern hemisphere is blanketed with states that have already joined non-proliferation treaty agreements, the Treaty of Tataloka, of Perlindaba, of Bangkok, and so forth. In fact, if the red states here are the nuclear states, the blue are the nuclear-free states, you can see that this is a north-south division. And all of us who worry about the non-symmetry and unfairness of what the North does to the South should take this as item number 1 on our agenda. Finally, I would just say, since we're giving this talk at MIT, that probably many of you are aware of what's called the Fermi Paradox, which is the odd fact that in this photograph alone, there are thousands of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, many of them with planets. Fermi's paradox stated the fact that with so many planets in the world that might have life conditions, how come we haven't heard about any other life forms? Many answers are given to this, but just one answer you may know, and the answer is that any planet that has people sophisticated enough to communicate with us across the galaxies is also going to be a people sophisticated enough to make a weapon to blow itself up, and will, and has. That is, that the problem of not blowing yourself up with the 10 weapons that Bob Redwine mentioned is extremely difficult. So that's just one more reason why all of us, not just a couple of us, all of us need to put our shoulder to the wheel and get these weapons dismantled. Thank you.
Right, okay. Thank you, Elaine, for those for a spark that'll hopefully catch fire. Patricia Weinman is going to handle the questions, and the floor is open, and Trish will call on people.
The first comment is Professor Tim Weiskell is here. He sends his regards to all of you, and he has a wealth of information which I'll share with you later. And Tim, if you have a specific question, please let me know, in addition to your Chomsky question. I'm going to pose for you, this is for Elaine. Alan Ware is asking, much of the opposition in the US Congress for an NFU policy is based on the argument that US first use option is required to protect US allies in Europe, NATO countries, and in Northeast Asia, Japan, and South Korea. No First Use Global is organizing high-level parliamentary and political statements from these countries in support of no first use. Can these statements be used in the US to help the campaign to get no first use adopted in the nuclear posture review?
I'm not sure whether they can be used in the nuclear posture review, but they can certainly be used in the background discussions that go into the nuclear posture review, and certainly they can be used in on the floor of Congress when and if these bills are on no first use and no sole authority are brought to the floor of Congress, because almost certainly Alan Ware is right that those arguments will be made that, well, even if our population doesn't want these weapons, those countries that we protect may want them. Of course, this is highly contestable. We've seen many nuclear protests coming from Japan, coming from Germany over the years. And it's a way that we have of exonerating our own responsibility of saying our own population doesn't want this, but we're doing it for other populations. No, no one is being served by these nuclear weapons. How could they be? How could it be in anyone's interest to slay millions of people in any country, no matter what country? Take the country you like least. Why? What did those people do that they should be harmed in this way? It makes no sense.
Thank you. Tim's curious if any of you have been working with the folks at Beyond Nuclear. I don't know if you know that program.
Who?
Beyond Nuclear. Nuclear weapons. And also, are you in touch ever with Noam Chomsky, since he's been quite
Regularly.
regularly?
I mean, we're in touch with almost all the organizations in the United States that advocate for nuclear disarmament, regardless of what their strategy is. And in that slide that I showed, the campaign, there's a dozen organizations who are the fundamental sponsors. I might make the point that there's no first use campaign is not an inside the beltway effort to influence, let's say, the nuclear posture review. It's a grassroots campaign to allow somebody moved by Elaine's points and concerns to get involved themselves. And if you go to the Mass Peace Action website and put in no first use, you can join the campaign yourself. And if you're a member of a Rotary Club or a local church or local community or campus, we're working on ways to develop the case.
Jonathan, the question about Beyond Nuclear, if that's the same as Beyond the Bomb, we have been in touch with them, just a slightly different name.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No questions right now.
It's true that, as Elaine raised the question, how could anybody find an interest in the wholesale destruction, incineration, of obliteration of whole populations? But if you think about the corporations who manufacture the weapons, they're in a unique position. It's a monopoly. The contracts can't be out. So now it's private corporations that manufacture the weapons, not the government. The contracts can't be outsourced to China or Mexico or Russia. They have to be domestic. They're all monopoly. They're all cost plus. The companies are guaranteed a profit margin no matter how much it costs them to make the weapons. It's quite uniquely profitable. And then they have billions of taxpayers' dollars, of our dollars, that they use to influence the Congress. So all the members of the Armed Services Committee have enormous sums of money contributed by the weapons industry, carefully documented by William Hartung from the Center for International Policy. And, there's quite a difference going to a congressman with $100,000 in potential and a few of us talking about the immorality of nuclear weapons. So numbers are key. Elaine's point is that the leverage we have is the ability to vote people out of office because they legislate against their interests. And so that's why this has to be a kind of broad movement. And, it can't be just an analysis.
Cole is asking, well, first states the US agreed in 1972 that Taiwan is a part of China, but now the US is almost openly committed to defending Taiwan if it gets into a military conflict with China. Will US geostrategic concerns for Taiwan and China shape the Biden administration's reluctance to follow through on Biden's earlier statements in favor of no-use policy?
Yeah, the China is certainly, I mean, we are, marching blindfolded into a possible catastrophe. And the amount of misinformation, the amount of omitted information that's coming out at us from many different media is really shocking. And I think we all just have to do whatever little thing we can do to stop it. Yeah, I think that Biden's wish to appear strong in relation to China may well interfere with his original impulse to jettison first use. But we have to make sure he understands that that's why every president allows it to continue. That's why every Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State goes along with it until they're out of office. And we all have to be incredibly grateful to them once they're out of office for coming forward and saying this is a disaster. But it has to be done while people are in office. Any president, any Secretary of State, any Secretary of Defense who's willing to step up and address this and talk about it with the people of this country is going to have the stature of Lincoln if he can get rid of these nuclear weapons. Because if we get rid of them here, they'll start to go everywhere. That is something that will be very, very large scale. But all of us have to do our part by being there behind him. Because again, if China is hit with a nuclear weapon, I mean, people would be on the streets. But once China is hit, it's too late to be on the streets. It's too late. You have to be on there. You can only prevent injuries before they're inflicted, not once they're inflicted. Then your outrage is useless. You might as well sit down in a corner and be quiet. Now is the time to speak out.
We have a conversation going in the Q&A about beyond the bomb is different than beyond nuclear. And and it's connected more with nuclear power plants, nuclear energy and disposal. I would like to bring up a question there from Jean Bell. Last summer, with Professor King's leadership, we initiated a petition regarding the Pentagon budget that was not published by Science Magazine. Why not publish the same petition and today talk to the public media, such as the New York Times, The Guardian, others, to reach out to the general public so they can be aware of this danger?
I think that's an excellent idea. We were shocked that Science Magazine wouldn't publish a letter signed by 50 scientific academic leaders, simply asking them that when they reported on the congressional budget appropriations, instead of just reporting the increase and decrease in the research accounts, they also reported the overall defense, the overall budget, including the overall defense budget. And we got a response from the editor that that would be political if they actually reported the defense budget. And, it kind of got stopped by that. But it's absolutely true that so few Americans, Americans have been paying income tax for 100 years, but no agency of the federal government ever reports back to the people how the tax dollars were spent. And the average, even informed citizens, has no clue that more than half their tax dollars go to the military. And the government and the military wants to keep it that way because they understand if people knew that, they'd change their attitude toward defense spending. So, but the idea that, yes, we have to figure out ways to get those calls out and about, newspapers, radios, letters to the editors. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And we've been remiss on that front.
I'm going to circle back now to Beyond Nuclear, which is indeed about nuclear power, nuclear waste, and the processing industry. Bob, do you have anything to comment on that? That many of these nuclear power plants are located on rivers, estuaries, right near the sea level. And as they rise, what will be happening? What kind of disasters are we facing that way?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question. You know, in terms of the solution to climate change, I continue to feel that nuclear power, safe nuclear power, next generation of nuclear power plants, et cetera, likely are going to be part of the solution, or could be. That said, that the public is understandably nervous about nuclear power plants and the waste that's produced. And so we have to, we scientists and everybody has to figure out the right solution to that. So I don't think that the biggest question is what happens with climate change, but the question of can nuclear power in the long run be part of the solution to climate change? And I hope it can be, but it's got to be done safely, no question.
Thank you. And Jonathan, you already mentioned the economic and financial benefits of keeping this machine going. And Tim was saying that are you or are other people working with organizations that are focusing in on just that? Are there any organizations that are dedicated to exposing this industry government connection?
So there are a number of campaigns. The ones we've I'd say the most active one for us is called Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare. And it involves reaching out explicitly to nurses, public health professionals, et cetera, and saying to them, we're with you. The nation is not spending enough money on healthcare, on public health, on responding to the pandemic. And the money is available. It's in the Pentagon budget. And we're going to support you for more public health spending if you'll support us on cutting the Pentagon budget. We've been very successful in Massachusetts. I have a good relationship now with the Mass Nurses Association, Mass Public Health Association. And now we're trying to broaden that to other states. We've also had campaigns called, for example, Subways, Not Submarines. That works in a state that depends on public transportation. But it doesn't have, a whole lot of staying power. Again, it was the argument that, why don't we have adequate public transportation in the most technologically advanced country in the world? Because we're putting all our technological expertise into targeting, a missile on the Moscow subway system. So, yeah, and then there are groups like Code Pink is in the lead now, and other groups trying to cut the Pentagon budget. But the Pentagon is enormously sophisticated. The Pentagon contractors, not the Pentagon. Pentagon contractors are enormously sophisticated, half a century of experience. The moment a city councilor or a state rep or a state senator or a US congressman starts talking about peace or stopping endless wars, the military industrial complex starts sending money to opposition candidates to run against them. Professional elected officials all know this. They don't talk about it, but they're hesitant to take on a Raytheon corporations, enormously politically and financially influential. Mm-hmm. And again, it's numbers. If you get enough people out in the streets, you can overcome that. But a small handful, even having enlightening arguments, won't do it. So the point about finding ways to broaden the base of these arguments, I think it's enormously important.
I have to say, in May this year, we had Dr. Heidi Peltier talk about not only the nuclear expense, but overall military. And I can post the link to that recording because she goes into great detail on those connections, the corporate connections, how those contracts become negotiated and then never renegotiated. And also Subrata Ghosh-Roy has incredible research on this as
You know,
well.
in those reports on the cost of war, which included the cost of, of soldiers and civilians being maimed and killed,
Yeah.
most Americans don't know that the Veterans Administration, charged with taking care of people killed in our wars, is not in the Pentagon budget. That's in the civilian budget.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
Veterans Administration is constantly being limited in ways that are totally inappropriate, given how important, given that the veterans have given their lives, their legs, their arms to the nation. It's another case of what's actually going on in the budget being completely obscured and untransparent to even concerned citizens.
I think that is it for questions. And if you have questions for each other.
Well, I just want to say one thing about, many people think of MIT as part of the war machine because in terms of conventional weapons and the Vietnam War, it's always had a heavy hand in that. But always around nuclear disarmament, it's been one of the beacons of light. And one of the reasons is because people like Trish, who are actually employed by the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, who has had the vision and the imagination to recognize that, faculty, graduate students constantly faced by these moral dilemmas, and you need, someone shining the light. And absent MIT Radius, we wouldn't be able to have these sessions. We wouldn't have the reducing the threat of nuclear war conference. You might think that in every university in the country, there'd be a group working on this. Absolutely not, right? During the anti-war period, there wasn't a university in the country that didn't have an anti-war group, student, faculty, staff. They're almost all gone, even at Wisconsin, even at Berkeley. And, we are trying a little bit to build this up. The Nuclear Education Project, right? Nuclear website, a little way to kind of maybe get into high schools. So we have to rebuild from the beginning, but we know it can be done.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, I am going to post the link to Heidi's. I opened up the chat right now to everyone. I'll also email all of the participants, our audience members. Thank you very much for attending and keeping this conversation going and moving forward. And to Jonathan, Robert, Elaine, we cannot thank you enough for your ongoing partnership with us. Thank you to the faculty newsletter as well, and to David Lewis.
Right.
So with that,
Thank you.
Thank you.
all right, we'll end this. Take care, everyone. Thank you.